Good evening, everyone. Getting a little reflection there. Welcome to Bhagavad-gita Satsang. I'm Hari-kirtana, and it's wonderful to see so many of you here with me this evening. A great honor to have you all here, and of course, a great pleasure for me to be here with you. And if you would be kind enough, as is our usual first housekeeping habit, to let me know that I can be heard by raising your hands in the participant window. There we go. Thank you very much. All right. Looks like you can all hear me. Let's take care of some of our usual housekeeping business for everyone who is new to the satsang. You can adjust your audio and video settings up in the upper right-hand corner, I believe, is where you will find that. No need to worry about your microphone or video camera. You can hear me, and I suppose you can see me as well. I, on the other hand, cannot see or hear you unless you type something into the chat window. You can also pop something into the Q&A if you prefer. Putting it in the chat will give everyone an opportunity to see your question or comment, your reflection on what we're going to speak about this evening. In our last class, chapter 18, the Yoga of Perfect Renunciation, we spoke about civic duty and the qualities of material nature, how everyone has a path to perfection, and even how perfection in imperfection is possible. We covered verses 40 through 48. In this evening's class, we're going to speak about how to achieve freedom from karma. Yoga and social distancing. That's right. It just so happens that we have hit upon a verse where the Sanskrit in the verse actually can be translated as social distancing, and we will see how Krishna feels about that in relationship to the pursuit of yoga. Timely, perhaps. And letting go of obstacles to yoga. So we are once again going to draw some comparisons between what Krishna is teaching us about yoga in the Bhagavad-gita and what Patanjali teaches in the Yoga-sutras as well. So we're going to cover verses 49 through 53. And before we do, we will, as usual, chant our invocation mantra, a brief explanation of the diacritics, the pronunciation marks that are used in transliterated Sanskrit, Sanskrit that is rendered in the Roman alphabet. A dot over an M indicates that in addition to closing our lips in front, as is usual for an M sound, we also close the back of our tongue up against the back of the roof of our mouth so that our mouth takes on a very round shape, as if we were wrapping our mouth around a walnut, and the sound comes both through our closed lips and kind of out of our jaw and nose at the same time. A bar across the top of a vowel indicates an open and elongated version of that vowel, in this case an A or an ah sound, as opposed to a vowel without a bar across the top. In the case of an A, that would be an sound. And with that, I will chant this mantra 3 times, and if you like, you can chant it back each time. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Translation: I offer my respects to the Supreme Person, the Son of Vasudeva, who is the all-pervading transcendence, the Son of Vasudeva being Krishna, the speaker of the Bhagavad-gita. Last week, just at the end of our class, we had a nice question that was relevant to our discussion about taking shelter of Krishna. What does that mean? What does that entail? So before we move forward with this week's verses, I just wanted to revisit that, because here's what happens. Every week, you offer comments and questions, and I respond to your comments and questions, and then I say, end meeting for all. And then I think about your questions and always feel like I've come up with a better answer or response to your questions and comments after the fact than I offered you during our actual time together. And this was no exception, except this I thought was worthy of revisiting, whereas most of the time I'm willing to say, well, okay, we'll let it go because now I'm just being a perfectionist. And also, this particular topic is going to become more and more relevant as we head into the home stretch of the 18th chapter and the Bhagavad-gita as a whole. The next 2 or 3 classes are going to move us in this direction of what does it mean to take shelter of Krishna or surrender to Krishna. So, in the Krishna Bhakti tradition, there are processes of Bhakti Yoga, and they begin with 4 principal activities. The first is hearing. Taking shelter of Krishna, first of all, means hearing Krishna's instructions. In other words, doing what we're doing right now, studying the Bhagavad-gita, studying Krishna's instructions, and seeing how they are applicable to our lives, what practical application they have in order to give a greater depth of meaning and spiritual experience to our lives, and also how to navigate our way through the material world. So hearing, and then hearing is followed by chanting. So one of the instructions we've heard earlier in the Bhagavad-gita is that one of the characteristics of someone who is in complete knowledge or has completely understood Krishna's instructions in the Bhagavad-gita is that they are constantly absorbed in the activity of chanting. Satatam kirtayanto mam, about me, mam. So satatam, sat, eternally, satatam, all the time. Kirtayanto, kirtan, glorification, or glorification by chanting specifically. Mam, me, about me. So chanting about the activities of Krishna, and for mantra meditation, chanting Krishna's mantra, or the Hari-kirtana mantra, which I demonstrated last week on japa beads, on japa mala, that is to say the beads that one uses for counting one's mantras in order to regulate one's practice by committing to a particular number of rounds on the beads, 108 beads on a string, so one round is 108 chants. So that would be the second activity of taking shelter of Krishna. Then remembering. What are you going to remember? You're going to remember what you heard. And we'll remember what we chant. When we hear about Krishna and Krishna's instructions on spiritual life and yoga, and then we repeat them, that actually helps us to remember. When you have to articulate your own realization or understanding, that actually helps us to learn and to remember. If you really want to learn something, teach it to someone else. So reflection, constant meditation, and we'll speak a little bit more about that this evening. And then finally, the fourth one is serving, being actively engaged in some kind of service. And the way you do this is you can set up a sacred space in your home, and you can have a murti, a deity form, or a picture of Krishna or Radha and Krishna, Krishna and his eternal feminine counterpart, who is his internal spiritual energy. You can offer incense. You can offer your food before you eat it. Prepare the food with the idea that you're actually preparing it for Krishna first, before you consume it yourself. Offering a candle. Meditating on the form that you see in your picture or your murti, in your sacred space. Helping others to make spiritual advancement by teaching is also a form of service. So these four things, hearing, chanting, remembering, and serving, they make up the foundation or the basis of taking shelter of Krishna or surrendering. And these two words are interchangeable. We usually think of surrender as meaning being defeated. But in this case, we're talking about offering yourself to someone, surrendering everything you have to this particular person who occupies the position of Ishvara. So this is also consistent with Ishvara Pranidhana, the instruction to offer oneself or surrender to the Lord that we hear in the Yoga-sutras of Patanjali. So I hope this quick revisiting of this topic is a little more clear and concise and specific than what I offered last week. And if you have any questions about this, let me know. This, like I said, is going to come up in the verses that we are approaching as we head into the conclusion of the Bhagavad-gita. And as I await your questions or comments, if you have any, I am going to read through the verses that we're going to cover tonight, and then we're going to go back to each verse and look at it in detail, as is our usual way of doing things. So we begin with verse 49 of the 18th chapter, which I have translated as Krishna continuing to speak to Arjuna here. One whose intelligence is unattached in all circumstances, who retains control of the mind, and who disregards all material desires, can obtain by practice of renunciation the highest perfection of freedom from reactions to actions. Verse 50. O son of Kunti, learn from me how one who has achieved this perfection can attain the stage of highest knowledge, the supreme realization of Brahman, by acting in the way I shall now summarize. Text 51. Being purified by one's intelligence and controlling the mind with determination, giving up the objects of sense gratification, being freed from attachment and hatred. Text 52. One who lives in a secluded place, who eats lightly, who controls their body, mind, and power of speech, who is constantly absorbed in the yoga of meditation, and who has taken shelter of detachment. And finally, text 53. Free from false ego, false strength, false pride, lust, anger, and acceptance of material things, free from false proprietorship, and peaceful. Such a person is certainly elevated to the position of self-realization. So now we'll go back. We'll look at each verse in a little more detail. And the first verse for this evening, verse 49, is the one that we will chant together. So a little more explanation about transliterated Sanskrit, Sanskrit rendered in the Roman alphabet with diacritics. So these, first of all, we pronounce each letter that we see. So when we see two consonants together, we hit the first consonant, slam on the brakes, and then continue with the second consonant. So the consonants don't merge together. A dot under an H indicates that you just make a short stop on the vowel that precedes it unless the dot under the H appears at the end of a word at the end of a line, in which case you echo a short version of the vowel that precedes the H back. You'll see what I mean when we get to the second line. The bars over the vowels, you have already heard. A dot under an R indicates that you're going to curl your tongue up into the center back portion of the roof of your mouth, as opposed to an R sound with your top teeth coming over your bottom lip. A regular R will be a one trill R, ra, as opposed to There's no sound. A dot under an S indicates an SH sound, sh. And a C is always a CH sound. So if you want a K sound, you get a K. If you want an S sound, you get an S. So a C is always a CH sound, and sometimes a C is followed by a CH, in which case you're just going to double up on that CH sound and put a little air after the second one. So we have one of these nice long Sanskrit super compound words at the end, and you'll see what that sounds like when we get there. So here we go. I will chant each line, and if you like, you can chant each line back. Asakta buddhi sarvatra jitatma vigata spriha naishkarmya siddhim paramam sanyasenadhigacchati. Translation, once again, one whose intelligence is unattached in all circumstances, who retains control of the mind and who disregards all material desires, can obtain, by practice of renunciation, the highest perfection of freedom from reactions to actions. So this describes freedom from karma. This was actually my first real major impetus for taking up yoga full time, which is to say I dropped what I was doing and moved into an ashram. And that's what I did, was just full-time 24/7 bhakti yoga. I had a job that is now, I'm certain, is extinct. Nobody has this job anymore. At least I'd be very surprised. I was a foot messenger in New York City. My job was to walk from one office building to another across Midtown, up and down, delivering packages filled with documents. I know that's probably hard for some of you to believe, but that's actually how it happened. You would take your document to the mimeograph machine, make a copy of it, put it in a bag or an envelope or something, hand it to somebody like me, who would then walk across town to deliver it to the person in the office who was meant to receive it. It was a slower process. But it was really good for mantra meditation. I used to walk, breathe, and chant in my mind, all in sync. And this is what I did all day, every day. And then one day, as I was walking on the south side of 42nd Street between 6th and 5th Avenue, just as I was alongside the park behind the main public library in Manhattan, I just out of the blue got this realization, and I just stopped. It was one of these moments where I was moving in slow motion and everything else around me was moving in high speed, or maybe it was the other way around, I don't know. But it was almost like a voice in my head said to me, you're responsible for millions of lifetimes of karma that you don't know what it is, and you're not doing anything about it. And I'd understood the idea of karma and reactions to actions from the time that I was fairly young. When I was a teenager, I understood that unnecessarily harming other living beings was bad karma. And so I told my mom that I was henceforth going to be a vegetarian. And she gave me some gentle pushback on that to see if I was serious. And I was, and that's how it was since I was 16. But this was later. I was in my 20s here, or like 20 years old, actually. And this was the first time since that first realization that it really came down to me that hard. And so I applied myself to the practice of yoga full time, at least at first, with the idea that I need to burn up all this karma that I have coming my way, because who knows what it is, and it can't all be good. So from the standpoint of yoga, this is a laudable ambition. So let's take a look at what this requires of someone. First, asakta buddhi. So buddhi means intelligence. Asakti means unattached. So having unattached intelligence. So what does that mean exactly? So unattached intelligence means that one's intelligence has risen above the influence of the modes of material nature. Now, earlier in this chapter, we heard Krishna describe intelligence or understanding in under the influence of the three qualities of material nature. So this just goes back to verse 30 in this chapter. And Krishna uses the same word, buddhi, to describe understanding or discernment or intelligence. O son of Prita, that understanding by which one knows what ought to be done and what ought not to be done, what is to be feared, what is not to be feared, what is binding and what is liberating. That is to say, what creates karmic reactions and what liberates one from karmic reactions, is in the mode of goodness. And then there's these other kinds of understanding that are in the modes of passion and ignorance, which we are obviously trying to elevate our consciousness above to at least get to the mode of goodness, because that is the launch pad for going beyond the qualities of material nature altogether. So that understanding, which is not pushed or pulled by the qualities of material nature, is unattached intelligence in all circumstances, no matter what's going on. One is able, by the power of one's discernment, to not be affected by attachments and aversions of this kind or that kind, really only attached to that which is spiritually elevating, but not attached to the qualities of material nature. Then Jita Atma, having control of the mind. That is to say, being capable of controlling the mind in such a way as to keep it focused on a spiritual object and not being pulled once again by the qualities of material nature this way or that way. So remember, we have a physical body made of earth, water, fire, air, and ether, solids, liquids, radiant energy, gases, and space, the 5 physical elements. But we also have 3 metaphysical elements that make up the material body, namely the mind, the intelligence, and the false ego. So here Krishna is speaking about the intelligence, which is above the mind, being unattached, the mind being controlled by the unattached intelligence. And then Vikitas Briha, without material desires. That is to say, not pursuing the objects of the senses with the idea that the pleasure of the senses constitutes happiness. So disregarding material desires. So even if the desire is there due to some impression in the mind that's still lying around, not affected by it. By this, Naishkarmya Siddhim. So Siddhi means perfection. So the perfection of non-reaction, Naishkarmya, sounds like karma, right? But Naish, not. So Naishkarmya means action without binding consequences for the one who acts. That's in a footnote to this verse, courtesy of Graham Schwagg's edition of the Bhagavad-gita. He gives this very literal translation. And then Paramam, supreme, paramount, the best. So the highest perfection of freedom from reactions to actions, or complete freedom from karma. And that's how you achieve freedom from karma, by reaching that state through our yoga practice. And that gets us to the point of freedom from suffering, because we don't have to suffer the reactions to our actions, nor would we get entangled with enjoying reactions to our actions that we might otherwise seek to enjoy on a material level. Freedom from suffering, though, is not quite the same thing as spiritual happiness. So back in the 5th chapter, in the 6th verse, Krishna uses the same word sannyas, indicating renunciation, and tells us, however, renunciation is difficult to attain if it is uncoupled from spiritual action, whereas the sage who is absorbed in spiritual action quickly attains the supreme destination. Why? What is it about spiritual action that makes renunciation easier? Because that's where the happiness is. The transcendental happiness of spiritual activity, as opposed to the mundane happiness of material activity, is what allows the yogi to renounce material activities. Elsewhere in the Gita, Krishna tells us that even though one renounces material activities, a taste for those activities may remain, and therefore there may still be some attraction. But upon attaining a higher taste for the happiness of spiritual activity, then one can easily relinquish the lesser pleasures of material pursuits or material consciousness. So when one engages in a spiritual activity, then one experiences happiness. What is a spiritual activity? A spiritual activity is, let's say, any of the 4 basic actions of devotional yoga: hearing, chanting, remembering, serving. So the negation of activities is just negation, but engagement in hearing and chanting, this is very joyful. Anyone who's ever been in a kirtan and just really gotten into a kirtan has probably experienced that kind of spiritual joy, spiritual happiness. Absorbing oneself in mantra meditation also brings about, when there's an object of meditation that is a person in the form of sound, who reciprocates with you, engages with you in a relationship of love, that's happiness on a spiritual level. When we remember someone we love, that's also happiness. And when the person we're cultivating love for is the supreme person, then supreme happiness. And some kind of active service brings about a higher level of happiness, even being of service to others on a relatively mundane level, in the mode of goodness. Serving those we care about brings about a higher kind of happiness or satisfaction or contentment than accepting service for ourselves. So what to speak of when that same propensity to experience happiness by service to others is reposed in the spiritual activity of engaging in service to the Supreme Person, that person residing in our own heart, our eternal well-wisher and best friend. So the keys to success in getting to this level of liberation from the obligation to experience karmic reactions is taking pleasure in the transcendental happiness derived from service to the Supreme Person, which makes it very easy to renounce material engagements that bring about fleeting pleasure at best. And as Krishna is going to explain in the next verse, this is how you get to the next level. Now Krishna is going to start speaking about an even greater secret. Up to this point, he's been speaking about the great secret of the distinction between spirit and matter and how to act in such a way as to be liberated from material consciousness and the reactions to one's actions. Now he's going to start a summary of an even greater secret, an even higher level of spiritual realization. But before I move on, I want to check in and see if anyone has any questions about what I've said so far, or any reflections or insights or realizations that came up during the course of my monologue on verse 49. So please share anything that you might like to share with us in the chat. And while I wait for your questions or comments, I'll go ahead and move on to text number 50. O son of Kunti, learn from me how one who has achieved this perfection can attain the stage of highest knowledge, the supreme realization of Brahman, by acting in the way I shall now summarize. So this is Krishna's introduction to how the greater secret of knowledge of Brahman, the spiritual substratum of ultimate reality. Here Krishna is going to describe for Arjuna how one can achieve this highest stage simply by being engaged in his own duties. So remember, the verses that preceded this section were about how one can achieve perfection and still engage in the activities born of their material nature and dovetail those material inclinations towards spiritual activity. And he is recommending this as the process of self-realization, and therefore the reason why Arjuna should not give up his duty of fighting, because it is through the natural duty born of his nature that he will actually become self-realized. And hold on for just a second. Okay, Brett asks, If service is related to bringing people closer to their inner light and God, does this correlate to correct service? All right, I'm just taking a second because I want to make sure I understand your question. Yes. I'm going to repeat the question. If service is related to bringing people closer to their inner light and God, does this correlate to correct service? Yes. So precisely. When I speak about spiritual activism, for example, there's kind of a ladder of motives that one moves up as one approaches spiritual activism as opposed to regular social activism. And we move from selfish motives to selfless motives to transcendental motives. And the transcendental motive is that there has to be some component, there has to be some part of what we're doing that elevates the consciousness, purifies the heart, and brings everyone involved closer to self-realization and closer to the supreme person, the Param Atma, within the heart. So I would answer your question as yes. Correct service from the standpoint of devotional service or yogic service, spiritual service, is service that has the intention and the practical effect of bringing both the person who is acting and the people who are affected by the action closer to their, as you say, their own inner light, or your own true nature would be another way to put it, as Patanjali puts it in the Yoga-sutras, and to God, or the supreme being, the supreme person. So yeah, I would say that gets a yes. All right, any other questions or comments? Please share them with me. Meanwhile, verses 51, 52, and 53 kind of go together. So I'm going to read them as a single statement once again. Then I'm going to go back and break it up into pieces. You're welcome. So Krishna continues, being purified by one's intelligence and controlling the mind with determination, giving up the objects of sense gratification, being freed from attachment and hatred. One who lives in a secluded place, who eats lightly, who controls his body, mind, and power of speech, who is constantly absorbed in the yoga of meditation, and who has taken shelter of detachment. Interesting phrase. Who is free from false ego, false strength, false pride, lust, anger, and acceptance of material things, free from false proprietorship, and peaceful. Such a person is certainly elevated to the position of self-realization. So the first phrase, being purified by one's intelligence and controlling the mind with determination. So here we have a correlation between Krishna's instructions on yoga and Patanjali's instructions at the very beginning of the Yoga-sutras, stilling the fluctuations of the mind in order to experience the true nature of the self. And how does that happen? The true nature of the self is first reflected to pure consciousness in the clear pool of the purified mind. So once the fluctuations of the mind stop and you have stillness in the mind, then you can see yourself reflected in the calm, clear pool of the purified mind. So you get all the schmutz out of your mind and you stop it from bouncing all over the place, then you can actually see yourself as you are. So when one is purified by one's intelligence and controlling the mind with determination, which is to say it takes some effort. Then giving up the objects of sense gratification. So this is an interesting phrase, sense gratification. The senses are always crying out for this, that, or the other thing that the senses like. The eyes like to see things that are beautiful, ears like to hear particular kind of music or sound based on the modes of material nature that you're influenced by, et cetera, et cetera. The key to controlling the mind is controlling the senses. Hence, renunciation of material sense objects, which then has to go hand in hand with spiritual action in order to experience that higher taste of spiritual activity, which makes it possible to resist the demands of the senses, the temptations of sense objects. So the yamas and the niyamas in the Yoga-sutras, the ethical guidelines and the personal observances recommended in the Yoga-sutras present yoga as a moral philosophy that encourages the disassociation, a disassociation from the idea of material sense pleasure as a source of happiness, which is only fleeting. And simultaneously encourages association with the idea of awakening our spiritual senses as a source of genuine and sustainable happiness. Because the reason for controlling the senses, according to the directions we find both in the Bhagavad-gita and the Yoga-sutras, is to purify the senses, purify the mind, and elevate the consciousness. It's not just a matter of a random or arbitrary set of moral standards or dictates, but rather they're purposeful. And the purpose is that by engaging in these restraints and observances, one gains control of the senses, one gains control of the mind, and one's bandwidth, one's scope of possible knowledge expands, increases. And the acquisition of transcendental knowledge and understanding, seeing the world as it actually is, seeing ourselves as we truly are, is the point of the practice of yoga, is the objective of the practice of yoga. Shena, is it about controlling sensations or just not reacting to sensations? It's about not reacting to sensations. So, from our starting point, we're conditioned to respond to sense objects that we see in our environment. And because we associate these different, pleasure or happiness with these different sense objects, we immediately experience a sensation. Our senses respond to sense objects either positively or negatively in varying degrees. And, this is still, this can be true for a long time. The days of my getting high are long gone. But if I were to be walking down the street, and here in Washington, D.C., it's legal, and smell somebody smoking some particularly excellent weed, my senses would respond to it. There would be this sensation, and I associate that with something pleasurable. It's just automatic because I'm just the glorious results of my misspent youth. I just kind of that was what I was attracted to. Whereas alcohol, just never really did anything for me as intoxicants go. So I'm not going to control the sensation of this response that I get from that kind of stimulation, but I'm not going to react to that sensation by going up to whoever's smoking that fine smelling joint and saying, hey, where'd you get that? Can I get some? That's not going to happen. So that's more like what we mean. You know, the sensations are there, and you don't want to try to artificially deny them or suppress them. You simply notice them and let them go, knowing that you're practicing a higher state of being. And in due course of time, Patanjali tells us also, by sustained practice over a long period of time. That's what it takes for these impressions of the mind to work their way out. So you're not reacting to sensations by indulging them, thereby leading to more craving. Yeah, you know, an impression on the mind is created, and if it's a favorable one, then we look to get that same thing that created that favorable impression on the mind, and then again and again and again, until the impression becomes so deep that it becomes a habit. And this is how we form habits. And then, depending on the nature of the object of sense enjoyment, we may seek it out so many times over and over again, just making the impression deeper and deeper and deeper, that it becomes an addiction. And so we indulge a habit to the point where we think we can't live without this thing. And now it becomes really, really hard to push back against that impression of the mind to flatten it out. It becomes a recurring fluctuation, like a giant crater in the mind. And yeah, the only way you get rid of it is by not seeking out and acquiring the thing that created the impression and pushing back on the impression with its spiritual counterpart. This is where Patanjali says, when unfavorable thoughts enter into the mind, think the opposite thing. So an unfavorable thought to the process of self-realization would be this habit I have, this thing that I like that is associated with material enjoyment or pleasure. Now, what's the opposite? Some engagement that is going to produce spiritual happiness that will allow me to renounce this thing. And it'll be hard in the beginning. Krishna, in just our last class or two back, spoke about how that which seems or tastes like, feels like poison in the beginning, but tastes like nectar in the end. That's operating with an understanding in the mode of goodness. And from that understanding, we advance to the transcendental platform. So just like if you have jaundice, then sugar candy tastes bitter. You don't want to eat anything. Everything tastes awful. And sweet things taste bitter. Now, actually, if you eat sugar candy, it's very, very sweet. But when you have jaundice in your disease condition, it seems very unpalatable. However, as you become healthy, your jaundice is cured, then you taste the sweetness of the sugar candy. So it's the same kind of thing. And it requires the humility of admitting that our material consciousness is actually a diseased condition of the soul. Pneumopathology is a phrase one of my teachers borrowed from a political philosopher named Eric Vogelin, who was describing atheism in the Soviet Union or something like that. But pneumopathology is the disease of the spirit. And our material consciousness can be thought of as a disease of the spirit. And to admit that this is our condition requires humility. And humility is the first mandatory prerequisite for the acquisition of transcendental knowledge. Lisa Marie, what about touch or feeling? Could you talk about this one? Because hugs can be medicine and touch can be healing, but now we are being asked to refrain from touch. Yeah, okay. Very on point. As of this recording, for those of you who are watching this in the distant future, who dug up a time capsule and you're watching this now, far from when I am originally speaking it. We are heading into the peak of the wave of the coronavirus pandemic. So this is particularly timely to be asking this question right now, as we are asked to distance ourselves from one another. I think that this speaks to our natural inclination to engage in relationships. Pure renunciation of material life without spiritual activity is dry, empty, void of feeling. So it may give relief from suffering in that you don't have the experience of suffering anymore. But what you're missing is the joy of relationship. So certainly loving touch between people who care for one another is very, very healing physically and emotionally, mentally. And from the spiritual standpoint, engaging in spiritual relationships is another form of touch. It's not touch on the same level, because what we're talking about when we talk about the material body is the physical and metaphysical body. Therefore, the 5 elements I mentioned before, plus your energy body, your mental, emotional body, your intellectual body, all the way up to your bliss body. All of these bodies or sheaths, coverings, koshas, are part of our material body. And the healing power of touch acts on these various levels. So, we have certain basic material needs, including the need for direct contact, some kind of physical intimacy between two beings. And now we have the difficult situation of having, out of concern, out of care, compassion, love for others, we actually have to keep our distance, which means we have to undergo the austerity of going without that physical sensation of touching another person, which can be, as you said, very comforting, very healing. And there's nothing about what we're talking about here that invalidates that. There's more than that, because the physical, emotional, psychological healing that may be there, that's also going to be temporary, because again, due to the influence of time and karma, the body, the mind, the heart will all experience some pain, some suffering. And coming in contact with one another on a spiritual level, engaged in spiritual activity, even if there's not physical touching of one another involved, elevates the consciousness to the point beyond suffering, and therefore beyond the physical interactions into the realm of spiritual interactions. But here's the thing. Just as we have material forms, we also have spiritual forms. The spirit is not necessarily formless. One can merge into the undifferentiated oneness of Brahman, but beyond that is the individual spiritual self and the awakening of spiritual senses. And the coherent organization of spiritual senses is a body, a form. And that implies that there's something to provide input to the senses and someone out there to engage with, which requires a spiritual environment or world. So just as we have a material world, there's a spiritual world. Just as we have material bodies, we have spiritual bodies. And the awakening of the spiritual senses is the awakening of the true nature of the self in our spiritual form, or svarup. And this is what Krishna is getting to as we head into the home stretch of this chapter. So, Lisa Marie, how does that do for an answer to your question? Please let me know. And as I wait and hope for Lisa Marie's approval, let's see if we can at least get through this part of this verse, and if necessary, as we are running out of time, we'll pick up with this verse when we meet again next week. So, being freed from attachment and hatred. So these are two of the obstacles to yoga, attraction and aversion. Material dualities of attraction and aversion, or likes and dislikes. Lisa Marie tells me it does okay. Would love to know what you think next week. All right, well, we'll get further into this next week. So that takes care of the first portion of this verse, 51, being purified by one's intelligence and controlling the mind with determination, giving up the objects of sense gratification, being freed from attachment and hatred. So these are all corollaries to what we've heard from Patanjali. Now, we have just enough time to look at the phrase, one who lives in a secluded place. So this is the phrase, vivikta sevi, living in a secluded place, which can also be translated as social distancing. Vivikta is a Sanskrit word that means solitary, secluded. It also means purified, clear understanding. So social distancing is an opportunity for purification of one's immediate environment. Spend more time in your own place. You're going to keep it clean, cleanliness next to godliness, all that kind of thing. You purify your own immediate environment. And this shaucha also corresponds to the Yoga-sutras, one of the niyamas. And then purification of one's consciousness by inward turning practices of study and meditation. Here's the thing. If you're always going out and about and always engaged in social activity, then you're going to be affected by all that stuff out there. Most of it is a distraction from the process of yoga, which is inward turning, pratyahara, looking inward. So time away from the world is actually required in order to do the inward turning or inner searching for the true self within, and finding that happiness that is our nature to have. So this is the role of social distancing, aside from the very practical matter of not picking up this virus, or to say nothing of spreading this virus that we're currently concerned about. I've had lots of conversations with people lately about looking forward, looking past this, what comes after. And one of the things that I am cautiously optimistic about is the idea that we will consider that we don't really want to go back to the way things were, because the way things were wasn't working, individually or collectively. There are a lot of things that we could do different that we thought we couldn't do differently. Maybe we'll realize that we don't have to fly all over creation all the time. And that skies can be relatively free of mechanical birds polluting the sky. Maybe it's better to have dolphins swimming in the canals of Italy than these polluting industrial boats. A lot of the things that we thought we couldn't live without, we're finding out we can live without them. A lot of the things that, the ways we live that we just thought, well, that's just the way it is. Turns out it doesn't have to be that way. So the optimistic takeaway is that the time that we have been given, that has been forced upon us to create some distance between ourselves and our usual social activities, provides us an opportunity to step back from that social activity and maybe see it a little differently, like through the lens of the modes of material nature, and dedicate ourselves to the project of turning inward that we normally would not give ourselves on account of feeling the need to go out, hang out with people, be social. Ileana, the verse that we are speaking about right now is chapter 18, verses 51 through 53. They are a cluster of verses that go together as a single comprehensive statement. So I hope that is satisfactory. All right, last call for questions while I share the screen once again to get to our wrap up. All right, we still need to talk about letting go of obstacles to yoga. So we will cover the second half of verse 52 and verse 53, which will speak about these things, letting go of the obstacles, and a few other details. We've spoken about how to achieve freedom from karma, and we've spoken a little bit about yoga and social distancing. I imagine that that topic will still be relevant next week. Unfortunately, it will be relevant for several weeks to come. So if we continue on that, that's also okay. If you have any other questions, you can send them to me, Hari at hari-kirtana.com. I will always be very happy to hear from you. Annie, you are very welcome. I'm always very happy to see you here. Jill, you're welcome. Lisa Marie, you're very welcome. My pleasure. Next week, we will finish up these this last verse and a half, and begin the greatest secret, how to know Krishna. And a binary choice, spiritual or material consciousness. There is, of course, the gray area of getting in between these two, going from material consciousness to spiritual consciousness. But we will hear Krishna describe that you are either moving in one direction or the other direction. And there's not a whole lot of sitting still. We'll cover verses 54 through 60. Shana, you're welcome. My pleasure. Thank you very much for being here. Glenna and Brett and Cameron, thank you very much. Very, very wonderful to have you here. Emily, you're very welcome. All right. Thank you for sticking around for an extra few minutes. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Sarah, looking forward to seeing you as well. And for the rest of you, thank you very much. I will end this meeting for all. Have a nice night.